Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. I'm Steve Doyle, and I'm your host. One of the primary reasons we do this show is to introduce our viewers to historic people or events or books that, we think that everybody would benefit from knowing more about. I also bring guests on the show that I know personally that I think our viewers would benefit from knowing more about as well, knowing better. And then there's the moment like tonight, where I have a guest on who I just personally want to know better. That brings us to our guest tonight, Tamar Zeffren. Tamar is a Sherlockian who I know and I've gotten to know over the last few years, but who I am very much looking forward to having this opportunity to get to know better and learn more about her. And you can do the same. Tamar is a professional archivist working with the American Jewish Historical Society. She's a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. And without any further ado, I welcome her to the show. So, Tamar, hello and welcome to the show today. I'm really happy that you are here and glad that you can join us today. And so I just want to say welcome.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm delighted. It's an understatement and honored to be in conversation with you in this incredible podcast. I got to tell you.
Oh, thank you so much. I don't know you, like I said in the introduction, I don't know you for a long time, like some of the guests on here. I've had people on here that I've known 20 and 30 years, but that's okay. I like you, and I'm looking forward to this as an opportunity to get to know you better, and for our viewers to get to know you better as well. So I like to start kind of in a standard way. I think it sets the stage and sort of gets people sort of oriented. So where are you coming to us from today?
Coming to you in living color from New York, the humming metropolis, but which is always the better for when Sherlockians can descend on it.
Great. So New York City.
Correct. New York City.
Wow. Are you like upper yes. Manhattan, lower Brooklyn?
Right above Central Park. So the upper West Side / Morningside Heights.
Oh yeah, sure. I know where that is. Oh,
New Yorkers are fond of pocket neighborhood titles, so sometimes
totally jealous. That's great. That is wonderful.
I invite all in Century to come visit. Very, very proud of our pocket.
yeah, that's great. Oh, that's wonderful. So, okay. Well, the second question that I always like to start with is, so I think this question is good. For you viewers out there, I ask this a lot of our guests, and but I think it's informative and I think it's important. How did you kind of fall under the spell of Sherlock Holmes?
The first time was almost entirely a solitary pursuit, which I think echoes with a lot of other experiences that fellow Sherlockians have shared. I had stumbled across a Bantam edition when I was 7 or 8, my parents' bookcase, and
like the paperback.
The paperback, correct, with the Lauren Esselman introduction. And what I did not realize for a few weeks after the fact, as I started squirreling it away, flipping through the pages, really sort of alighting upon a story when the title would catch my eye, not necessarily following it to the end initially, was that the print on this copy was so cheap that I was actually leaving a crime trail every time I snuck the book out and was reading it, under the covers, leaning against the wall. And for a few days or instances, I couldn't gauge exactly how my parents always knew that I had been, staying up late. I had been sneaking the book out when I had been expressly told not to. And then I realized it was the object itself that was giving me away. And instead of perhaps learning the lesson that was intended from that, I dug in even further and thought, well, I'm in for it now. I'm going to make my way to the best of my ability as a little kid through the stories. I didn't really try to tackle the novels at that point, but it had always been crystallized in my mind at that moment was a sense of excitement. And in fact, it really was one of the first non-dictionary, but dictionary experiences that I had, because there were words often that were just askew enough from what I was beginning to recognize in other pursuits. And I was avid about looking up these definitions. And so I had created for myself this sort of learning channel that was sparked by that edition.
That's so interesting to me because, now that you say that, I do remember when I was reading the stories for the first time a million years ago, coming across phrases and terminology that I was completely unfamiliar with. And I had to go and look that up too. And yeah, that's really interesting. I've always looked at the Sherlockian canon as sort of the complete gateway to lifelong learning.
Absolutely. It was a primer for me at that stage in my life, and in a way, looking back upon it now, that was perfect for sort of that childhood development. And as I said, it was really a solitary pursuit. It was on my parents' bookshelf, but it was not, I don't recall that it sparked particular conversations with them. This title, we were a family of avid readers, so that wasn't remarkable in of itself. The second time that I encountered Sherlock Holmes, and this may resonate with things we'll discuss later, was as an undergrad, when I decided to purchase my own copy of Sherlock Holmes. I regret that I actually can't recall which edition it was. I know that it wasn't the Bantam paperback. I had learned a little bit
to step up from the
like to think in the self-fashioning way of an undergraduate,
right.
And that was one of the the limited space allotted that I had gotten a complete edition, and of course at that point I was able much more to appreciate some of the really the metatextual, without even knowing to call it the game at that point, just the greater universe. But the social aspects of it, really the fulfilling communal aspect of it came even after that. And that had been prompted by, at that point, having graduated and working in New York, but it had been prompted by experiences in a few other, let's say, fan communities, primarily also being a huge Tolkien fan, and starting to become more familiar with the internet as a springboard for community. Online, and then how that translated or really transmuted, if you're fortunate, into offline opportunities for learning, for companionship, for exciting new connections. And at some point, I mentally made the decision or made the leap and thought, wait a minute, I have to believe that at least in New York, how naive I was, and at least in New York, there are other people who would want to talk about Sherlock Holmes in real life. And
wow, that's really interesting to me. First of all, I'm really interested that so many of the Sherlockians that I know, and as our viewers longtime viewers of the show will remember, and if you are involved in this community in any way, you know that so many of our fellow Sherlockians have multiple parallel interests besides Sherlock Holmes. And it's fascinating to me that you are a Tolkien fan or a devotee as well, because I love Tolkien. And it's a great thing. So wonderful to hear that. Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
That can be an appendix.
Pardon me?
That can be an appendix.
Right. Exactly. And now it's time for our Tolkien podcast. Well, we'll talk about that in person sometime, at the weekend or something. So making a mental note of that. So
absolutely.
But great. Oh, that's so interesting though. And right, you're right there in New York City. And so how hard was it to you know, our last show we interviewed, I talked to Ira Matetsky, and he talked about how difficult it was for him to find the doorway. He knew that there was a community of Sherlockians, but he also talked about how hard it was for him to find the door to come in. And how hard was it for you? Because I find that interesting, because Sherlockians seem to be everywhere, you know. So how hard was it for you to find that entry point into the Sherlockian community?
In one sense, it was quite straightforward. I really had the luxury of being in New York City, and I didn't even realize it at that time that I don't know how I first found Susan Rice's contact information, but it was, and I'm so pleased to be another link in the extraordinary chain of people for whom Susan and Ash have been, their first introduction or a very significant foundational introduction to the Sherlockian world. But I contacted Susan. I need to be able to remember the sort of foundational step in between, and even though she responded with alacrity and gave me the information about Ash Wednesday, I actually dithered for quite some time, in a sense which might seem strange given the embarrassment of riches in terms of Sherlockian groups in New York. But it had kind of prompted in me a step of, I had gone so many years without really connecting that this was a subject I could talk to other people about. And I had not had that hesitancy about other books that I was interested in or other characters. I mean, and certainly being a token devotee, I was already fairly well practiced at least initiating conversation on certain arcane aspects with other people. But there's something about Sherlock Holmes. You say it, it sounds resounding, it sounds weighty, and it sounds like there's a whole body of knowledge behind it. And maybe it's not appropriate, there's that word, to try to go out and find other people who to discuss it with before you can really, you can contribute to the conversation. And so I remember being in that headspace for a bit in between when Susan sent me the information, and it was probably maybe a few months before I ventured into my first Ash Wednesday meeting.
So once you took the plunge, how long did it take you to get over that? Because we have a lot of people who just plunge in and
in the probably in the length of time it took me to describe the anxiety that I felt, overcame once I was in great company. And I realized then, as now, so much of it is about the kismet. It's not just the company itself, but the who the guests were passing through the space, what the topics of conversation were. I mean, it's such an alchemy, and just the kindness that people have, just taking joy in finding a new face and a new name that is excited about the subject. That no one's expecting you to come with the whole puzzle completed. You have your corner piece. That's, you think, oh, well, this is just part of an outline of a cloud. This is not even a whole cloud. How does this contribute to the conversation? But actually, it's an interesting piece all on its own, not just because it completes a frame, but because you're coming to it with your own passion and your own honesty about why you're drawn to this character and the whole world.
I find that so interesting, and I know exactly what you're saying. I think that like you talk about Tolkien and other communities around bodies of literature or other fandoms, other however you want to characterize it. But I found that there's something really amazing and special about our Sherlockian community, and you're right. I mean, I've been in it a long time, and it is exciting when someone shows up, someone new, who can, who you can tell pretty quickly, this is someone who has something to offer. Whether they're ready to offer it, that's a different story. But you can
Right.
tell, because nobody, is required to do anything really, but that idea that, oh, I can tell that he or she is, yeah, welcome aboard, because, eventually you're going to have something really interesting to offer. And it may be entirely social, and that's important too. And
Yes. The
yeah, so I
spark.
know exactly what you're talking about. That's really so interesting. So I try to imagine what it would be like to be entering this community or this hobby in New York City, because I live in Indiana, and I imagine it was quite a different experience from entering it in the, in New York City, where, there's like 15 science societies within a stone's throw. And so when you took that plunge, what was that like? Was it like suddenly you were immersed in an entire universe, or did you just sort of kind of ease into it?
I think that it was more precipitate in terms of the social aspects, not even that it went from zero to sort of high octane, Sherlockian frolics every night of the week. Although that would, and there are many people in our hobby who do manifest that. And I
I
think
know, right? It's so true.
but that definitely happened more quickly for me than, just to return to the puzzle analogy for a moment. I guess I'm committed now. In more so than beginning to understand, I had known there's a lore, there's a body of scholarship, of whimsical cleverness about our hobby. And it took me, I would say I took a more roundabout path towards devoting more time, not just on my own to learning about it, acquiring it, but also to adding a new dimension to my conversations with these new friends and companions that I was making, and saying, I'm here to listen to you talk about these, previous irregulars, Scion founders from not just all over the US, but all over the world. I was certainly a few years in before it really hit me, the scope of societies in Switzerland, in Japan, looking at previous listings on SherlockTron and other resources, that there had been Scions in Australia. It was just really the puzzle, the globe
Yeah.
expanded for me, and that was dizzying in the best sense. And that really, I like to think that I waited until I had a little bit more of a grounding and a confidence in my conversations about my love for Sherlock Holmes before I then started returning to a second love, which was research, and sort of steeping myself in the stories of everyone else who had loved and studied before.
Well, that's very interesting. Now, two things. One, it's like, it's true. Once you come in, once you're embraced, and I like to think that most everybody is embraced. Everybody's embraced, and welcomed in. I don't know of anybody who has ever been, like turned away from this hobby, and I think that it is, it's, but it is kind of you never really understand how big it is until you cross the threshold.
Yes, and
And
maybe. I'm sorry, go.
No, I think it's a good thing you don't know, because he may never do it otherwise.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And
So I was gonna. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
one other element of that progression was, what I found extremely helpful was that I started to expand, yes, the people base, the knowledge base, but also kind of familiarity with the Scion logistics, because I eventually took a leadership role in the Priory Scholars, and was invited to join the Baker Street Babes in that sort of 2015 to 2016, as I recall, period. And so that was kind of a level up, not only in terms of my exposure to this world, but also in having more experience adopting an outward looking mentality. Okay, I feel this way about it. How do I support it for others? How do I facilitate it for others? I think of that as being another, you know, another, not just step, but like the guardian that should accompany you as you go through this hobby of like, I know how I feel about it, and can I make that experience happen for someone else? So there was a period where I was mostly focused again on my own knowledge, but it is exponentially more fulfilling once I was involved in running meetings and you know, on a much lower level, sort of scheduling guests and thinking about agendas, toasts, and that whole apparatus.
That's great. I love that. I totally get it. I mean, that's the thing I found, when you're in it and it's happening for you, I found that I just want to share it with everybody. I want, I've been so blessed personally with, so many opportunities. And I just find it kind of my mission to sort of pay that forward to people. And it sounds like that's kind of how you feel. It's like, oh, let's just get this out to everybody who wants it. And I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it's a unique community. I mean, I've been involved in science fiction communities and all kinds of things. And it's like, it's not the same. It's not the same elsewhere. And it's a beautiful thing, I think. So, so you mentioned the Priory Scholars. Talk about your involvement with this science society.
I was initially approached by Judith Freeman, who was then the headmistress of the Scion, and Nick Martorelli and Chris Zordon, who were the faculty, to organize and coordinate toasts, homeworks, presentations for the meetings. I should actually take a step back and say that the Priory Scholars, the structure of their meetings are modeled after, of course, the title of the story from which we take our name. So there are lessons, homework instead of alongside toasts.
It's like school.
There's faculty, the headmistress. I mean, we try to leaven that framing very quickly, because we certainly don't want it to feel onerous for anyone. But that's the sort of fanciful structure that we have.
Yeah, it's good.
And it was it was a very low pressure and helpful way to get more accustomed to planning and logistics, and also getting to know personalities, right? Because it always comes back, whether it's the personality on the page or behind the page or in the room. It's the personalities are what are the engine behind a successful meeting, successful conference.
We have a lot of personalities in this hobby.
That is not an endangered resource, that's for sure. And really, with every that really just I think it's self-fulfilling, because it replenishes one's love for the hobby, for the people. But I found it was useful that it was gradual, that I got to know within a smaller sphere. It wasn't, I don't think I could have jumped in and been at the helm of a multi-day conference, for example. I think that there really is, it really is proportionate to your comfort level and the connections you have with people. And so I did that and I'm still on the faculty of the Priory Scholars. So I've been in that role now for a number of years, and but I cherish that as really a first foray into we're continually talking to people, trying to bring people in, retain longtime visitors and not longtime visitors, longtime attendees, or we're all visiting. We're all sort of passing through these conversations.
It's interesting to me because I have an opinion about the value of science societies. There was the golden age of science society creation was in the 1940s. Boom, there was this sort of big bang of following the start of the Baker Street Irregulars, and these organizations flourished all across the country. And then the creation of them would wax and wane through the decades. There was another great flowering of them in the 80s, 70s and 80s. And, there was a period of time where I thought they were kind of fallow, but I'm sort of sensing the rise of the Science Society again. And I think it's really valuable to hear you speak about what a value it was for, especially new Sherlockians to come in. I think all the great work is done, all the real work, in a kind of a daily basis is done in the Science Societies. And,
Right.
so all you listeners out there, you find one if you're not in one. They are, this is where your real Sherlockian daily life can happen, and it's really an important thing. But
you can imbue it into your, there's these like jewels in a necklace. You have these conferences, you have the weekend, these outsized amazing gatherings to look forward to. But how it sustains is right. It's you and the stories, you and your, if you're fortunate, local scion or the networks, even if it's not a scion per se. I think that's the lifeblood.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. That's so interesting to me. Well, believe it or not, Tamar, we need to take a break to hear from our commercial sponsor. All right, we're back. So I'm going to talk about, so now we've talked about how you found Sherlock Holmes and you entered this hobby. You talked about the Baker Street Babes. What was that like? Because that was that time period was just kind of this sort of white hot experience. And I don't think we've ever actually spoken to anybody on this podcast yet about what that time must have been like. And you were in it, like in it. What was that like?
Heady, to say the least. And I joined, I think, white hot is correct. I would say that I joined after the first flame, the first tier where, I was, avidly following them, and I didn't have to work that hard to follow them because you could heard of them everywhere. The range, the visibility was incredible. And it was really, it was unsettling in a wonderful sense when I was approached to join, because unlike the sort of what felt organic introductions to Ash and to the Priory Scholars and aligned experiences, the Baker Street Babes, it was like in Klieg lights, and I wasn't really accustomed to, certainly thinking of myself in that context or thinking of anything within the Sherlockian world in that way. And in a sense,
I think a lot of us felt that way.
Right.
For better or worse.
Right. And I think I was aware of that too. That's the thing when you're observing something for a period of time, you're not only aware, you're forming opinions, but you enter into a body of opinion with the people that you interact with regularly, and something that comes across your radar so frequently, you almost don't know whether, is this what I think about it, or I'm grafting onto myself an opinion about it. So in a sense, I think I consider myself very fortunate that it was after the sort of the first wave, I would say, that there had been, the outside celebrity aspect, the Comic-Con appearances, the London-based events were not as much a feature at that point, partially because of the relocation of a number of the principals, the BSV's founder, Christina, and so forth. But it was, in a sense, and perhaps you will appreciate this, it was my first introduction, even at a distance a bit, to podcasting and to any sort of radio production, as in, and through that, it actually was a tremendous gateway also for me to begin to grasp the long and storied history of Sherlock Holmes in radio and in media, not just the printed page, but the currency of being part of the Babes and trying to join conversation, recordings and guests and conversations where I could was, it was unlike the preceding months and years of just having these incremental conversations with Sherlockians. This was being, thrown in at the deep end in a sense. And through it, I'm very fortunate that despite the far-flung nature of a lot of the drivers of that group, that I've been able to retain some great friendships that emerged from it. So again, once behind the glitz and behind that, the name brand, there really it introduced me again to, folks all over the world, who otherwise I would not have had occasion, I think not even necessarily at the weekend to encounter. But it also left me with an increased consciousness. And I think this speaks to something I've heard you mention before in other conversations, the fascination about the Sherlockian world itself as an object of study. We are fascinated with, Sherlock Holmes and the game and the literary agent, and we each take our paths. Do we all realize that itself is already it's an object of abiding fascination? The Baker Street Babes is one expression of that in recent years, but there's so much more that people are continually studying, remixing, having opinions
so
about.
True.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole history of, there's Sherlock Holmes, and then there's the history of the culture that's devoted to the literature and all its other manifestations. And I'm hard pressed to find another. I think the closest thing that might come to it would be Star Trek. A community that's, but it's much younger, relatively speaking, and it's not quite the same. And something that's been around for so long, like the Sherlockian community, for instance, and the Baker Street Irregulars. It all started with the Irregulars. Everything blew out of that, and then something that's been around that long, it becomes an object of interest and study in its own right. And I think what makes it interesting to me anyway is that that history is people, it's human beings and how they move and interact within this space. And I find that just super interesting, very it's very indicative of human nature. You see, if you're in it long enough and you're involved in it regularly, you see all kinds of things that people, it's just human beings. And it's a community, it's a true community. And I just find it fascinating. I just really do. And it's so enriching. I'm sure that I would imagine that you feel the same way. It's just the people that you meet and the experiences you're afforded are just quite remarkable. So,
yes. And it can be at everyone can have it at their own pace. I think that
right. And at their own level of what, I'm comfortable with this sort of level of involvement. Yeah. And pace, like you said. Yes, exactly. There's no requirement, to do something beyond what you want to do.
Right. It should be joyous.
Right, exactly. Then it's onerous, and who wants that?
Precisely. That should be the course.
So I want to ask you. So, do you have a particular interest? Do you have a particular area of interest within this large, sprawling hobby of ours that you are particularly fascinated with? We've sort of been talking about what the community's like and that sort of thing. But do you have an area of interest? You talked about research earlier. Is there something that particularly fascinates you?
I am, by professional inclination, I consider myself very often to be, I'm not going to say dilettante, but I am immersed in a bunch of different ongoing stories. As an archivist, I am, whether I am initially involved in a research consultation or I am engaged in accessioning a collection or I am, perhaps transferring a collection to another repository. I'm meeting with someone who's conducting their own research or going on their own quest. I feel that I'm often the sum total and more of all of these ongoing projects and these ideas out there in the ether. And it's sometimes I think that one of my strengths is being an avid audience member. That I'm very I find it extremely fulfilling to facilitate. And sometimes and there's a million avenues to do that in the Schlocking world, in in my professional spheres. So that's often the framing that I start with, and that's actually where the intimidation factor comes through a little bit, because there are so many ideas that come through my mind when I reread the stories or when I'm in conversation with another Schlockian, and then when I begin to research and to go through the BSJ or look in other publications. Indeed, there's a long and storied history of someone grappling with that topic, and on the one hand, it's very heartening to know, like, that no matter what puzzle piece I'm turning over, someone in our community has dedicated time and resources to not just to exploring it, but to putting it out there for my enjoyment, for the whole community's enjoyment, for such a low threshold of entry. But at the same time, I feel a little bit wistful that I haven't alighted yet, or rather, I haven't isolated sort of one strand that I'm particularly interested in, because it's the joy of the research itself and trying to support the preservation and access of that. So,
well, that's a thing. That's a thing,
right. And
that
so
is a thing. I mean, it is. It's actually important. And yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's so. Well, for one thing, I think I appreciate what you're saying. I'm interested in what you're talking about. That you start looking at a particular subject, and then you because of your the fact of your interest in being an archivist and that sort of thing. You have an appreciation of all that's come before it, and I think that's one of the joys of being a Schlockian at this time, is that we all have a extremely rich body of work that we can draw on, and rather than being intimidated by it, we should just really embrace it and find interest in it in and of itself. But that also kind of brings us to what your role in the BSI is right now. You are a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, and what year were you invested? I'm sure you remember. But.
And I do. in 2017, and I have to say that January was, nothing could ever match it, because a week or so after I got invested, I also got engaged, and so
wow, that was a big month.
he joked. He said, it's not like I had an inside scoop of what was going to happen, but I'm glad that I knew not to schedule anything around that first weekend in January.
Okay, so which was bigger, the engagement or the? No, I'm just kidding. Don't answer that. Just gonna. That's funny. Okay, so wow, that's a big year. That was a big January.
Yes,
that year started off with a bang.
Absolutely, and an amazing class. Like the classes who came before and the classes who have come since. But it was incredible.
What I find interesting is that and I don't know that anybody's ever talked about this, but the idea of your class. I mean, I've been in the BSI a long time, and nobody ever really paid attention to who like hung on to it. Mm-hmm. Like you were aware of it the night of, right? But that you would hang on to it and like have a community of your class. Mm-hmm. That's a relatively new phenomenon, and I think that's a really cool thing. And I have to think that that's a generational thing, and I'm a little jealous of it. I will not lie. It's a good thing. So that's so interesting. So yeah, so now you're in the BSI, and the Irregulars are really good um, at. I will say this: the BSI is really good at spotting talent, and and there's so much need within the society, of course. So tell us about what role you were tapped to take on.
Well, I will just, before I answer that, just to put it in its proper context, my first encounter with the BSI, so certainly as a non-BSI member, was working on the Baker Street Irregulars Trust with Andy Solberg, who was chair of the trust at that time. To the first assignment that I was involved with was to work on all of the remaining BSI dinner pages that were in the queue, so to speak, to be posted to the BSI Trust website. And so that was, Steve Rothman had gotten wind of my archivist, moniker, and we had some, as you said, the BSI is extremely shrewd about, addressing a need and identifying individuals when they think
Yeah.
of you.
Hey, what about
And
Tamar? I think she could do that.
and so in speaking about it now, this is just so informative in a number of ways. In a sense,
I bet working on that was an education in and of itself.
yes, precisely. I was going to say, in reflecting on it now, it's an interesting parallel in a certain sense to my first Scion experience, in that you are immersed in something. You're not fully of it at the outset. You're not charged with overseeing the whole enterprise, but through the work, you're getting to know the history, to know the personalities, and to get a clear sense of what are the objectives. In this case, what is who is the audience? What are the objectives of the trust? Who are the audience for these pages? And certainly for the first, how they say, if you start a new job, it might be a year before you feel you're really oriented, in a sense. And I'm sure it was that in this initial fragmented process, because I was working with Andy directly, which was a wonderful partnership, and also learning what sources he was drawing from. So it was another step again in seeing what came before, and sort of hearing this shorthand, not just about publications or about earlier BSI leadership, but about individuals within the community who had maintained photos, who had recorded the dinners, and were now, wanted to give those over, but wanted to know that they were going to be stewarded properly, and that they were really going to be enhancing the history and accessibility of research about the BSI. So that's
Was that exciting for you? I mean, I can imagine that, given your professional activity, and obviously that's something that must have been really exciting, I would imagine.
It was the perfect marriage, and I'm sure that whoever else had perhaps floated my name up as someone who would be interested in taking on this project, I hope would have felt that they had gauged correctly. I mean, that really, the dinner pages themselves, I think we finished the backlog within a year and a half, I want to say, which, given that everyone, working on these, again, links in the chain, has a full-time job or more than one, and is doing this sort of interstitially for the love of the game. It was a wonderful fast-forwarded education for me, especially when it came to the names of previous irregulars. To get to track sometimes the progression of a name from someone giving a toast to someone becoming invested to someone getting a 2 shilling award, to perhaps they edited a publication. And just as with fashions, as you said before, the BSI as a community, as a cohort, reflects the times that it's set in and that it's drawing from. That in the aggregate is fascinating. To me, to my temperament, this was amazing. And so I came in already having had that exposure over a number of years, and last year was asked to join the BSI Trust Board.
So talk a little bit before What is the BSI Trust?
Okay. So the BSI Trust is the entity that whose mandate it is to preserve, steward, and render accessible the history, legacy, and impact of the Baker Street Irregulars. Of course, for irregulars and their families and circles, but also to the public at large. Because as we've touched upon before, there is a vast and I think never diminishing interest and even hunger for, Sherlockian studies, and the BSI is such a focal point of that.
Yeah. The Sherlockian universe has really, just expanded exponentially over the last decade, I would say. And I've seen it's happened. It kind of happens in waves and gets bigger. Every successive wave comes, it gets bigger, more complicated, more complex. And yet, and at some point, there have been people who have wondered, how relevant are the BSI to this larger, expansive universe, which has sort of taken in, other elements of, like fandom elements and just international kind of reach and all this stuff. I'm just wondering how you would answer that, having been immersed in a sort of kind of accelerated history of the BSI and its activity and personalities involved. How relevant is the BSI, do you think, to the larger community?
I think it's fundamental, and saying that not in any sort of self-congratulatory way, but simply because if you want to know where you are or where you're going, you have to know where you've been and which group has been there the longest, which has had the personalities involved from the beginning, is the BSI. The nature of archives is, I don't say neutral because I actually think that elides sort of dangerously the fact that there are human interventions, there are humans making decisions about what to save and not save and what to send where and so forth. So the sooner that we all acknowledge that and are honest about it, I think the more effectively we can do our duty, our responsibility as stewards of information and allow that, those records to enhance the questions that people are asking today, and even more importantly, the questions that future generations, whatever the Sherlockian world looks like for them, will come to ask. I often, when I give presentations on records or information management, start off with a startling sounding statistic, which is something like, only 1 to 3% of all, let's say, recorded history. That's just saying that that's in a medium that can be preserved and or reformatted in some way is preserved, in fact. And so
that's amazing.
Against that, and I'm sure that there could be quibbles with that statistic as well. But I think roughly it conveys what it needs to convey effectively, which is that the landscape of what gets saved is so minuscule in a sense compared to all of the, compared to what there was, what came before. And so any efforts that go towards preserving something, there really has to be, sometimes it is just a confluence of events and it's luck, but there's often, there's an engine behind it. It's to, often to consolidate, to consolidate power, to sort of establish a certain line. And often it's devotion, it's love that rescues and stewards things long after the personalities that created them and whose names are echo in them, long after they're not around anymore. And the fact that the BSI has had successive generations of individuals who are so accomplished in many other spheres in their lives, having nothing to do with Sherlock Holmes, who have dedicated themselves to preserving it, and the diversity of those individuals, of course, also has continued to expand, which is wonderful. I mean, I think speaks to, it answers its own question, that so many have loved this and have shepherded it. I think in this case, redounds to that question. Is it, why are we saving it? Is it relevant? In the end, it's not for us now to answer, will it be relevant in the future? But we can point to the landscape now, and we have myriad examples of the fulfillment that so many of us derive from this community, and say, yes, it is relevant. Whether or not you're in the BSI, whether or not you even really know about Sherlock Holmes, the beauty of archives, the beauty, and also the I would say anxiety a little bit almost, is that you never know who's going to have a question, what discipline someone's going to come across, and then they come across the BSI records, used to answer questions we would have never anticipated.
Right. You never know what somebody's going to come in and ask about. That is the abiding mystery. Really, to do Sherlock Holmes proud is to say that is the abiding mystery too. Is what new questions are going to be conceptualized down the road. And there's always new questions. That's what I find so fascinating. It never runs out of gas. It never does. Well, Tamar, we are, believe it or not, out of time. I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I just glanced at my timer. I was like, darn. But we're out of time. So I want to thank you so much. This was great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for being on our show. And I have other questions, but I'll just ask them to you in person next time I see you.
Looking forward. Thank you so much for the privilege. It was wonderful to speak with you.
The privilege is ours. So thank you so much. And take care. And I look forward to seeing you again sooner than later, I hope. So
absolutely echoing that. Take care.
Take care. You too. And that's it for this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. That was really fun. And I want to thank Tamar again for being on the show with us. I also want to thank you in the audience for your continued support and your just generous feedback. The comments we get just are so humbling and so generous. I'll just share a few of them with you right now. Darren Ross, I want to thank you. You said, thank you, Mark Jones. Thank you, Mark and Steve, for such a great interview. That was our 2 episodes ago when we talked to our friend Mark Jones. Cindy Brown, I want to thank you too. She says the interviews just keep getting better and better. I kind of think they do too. Thanks. And I want to say, I also want to share this one with you. This show is my favorite Sherlockian podcast. On the day it comes out, it is the centerpiece of my evening. Thank you, Jay Grant. I'm very grateful for that. And I want to say thanks. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Your continued support means everything. So be sure to like us on Facebook, subscribe to our channel on YouTube. It does matter. It helps out a lot. If you subscribe to YouTube, our YouTube channel, you'll get an alert every time there's a new episode. And with that, I just want to say thanks. And I look forward to seeing you all again here at the Fortnightly Dispatch.